Good morning. Once again, we are pressing on with our hermeneutics instruction in the middle of Module 2, which is the Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. And this happens to be Lesson 4 out of the 6, bridging these gaps that we've been talking about. And this morning we're going to talk about the literary context of Scripture and figures of speech. Just prior to this, we've talked about not only the history of interpretation, we've talked about how grammar and syntax come into things, as well as the cultural context, bridging that gap. Rick did that, and now we're going to talk about how the Bible is a marvelous piece of literature. But as you deal with literature, there are different kinds of literature in the Bible, and every kind of literature has a little bit different approach hermeneutically, and we're going to talk about that. The Bible is not a textbook or a newspaper. We would agree with that. It is a marvelous literary masterpiece. Right off the bat, we want to make that clear. God has given us His truth using a variety of not only of authors, but of literary forms. And it's this lesson we want to define and review these various forms or kinds of literature. Another word for it is genre, different genres of literature. Last lesson we discussed the reality that every letter and word of the Bible is inspired. You remember we put that on the board. Even the stroke of a pen that changes one Hebrew letter into another Hebrew letter is inspired by God in those original manuscripts. Words convey meaning when they're put together in the proper grammatical structure and context. That's what we were talking about. Excuse me. However, it's not just the words, sentences, and paragraphs that are inspired, but every literary form and style of writing in the Bible is inspired by God. Poetry in the Bible is inspired. The narrative portions of the Bible are inspired. We might call them theological narrative to give us truth about God and His person and work. Logical discourse and letters of the Bible, like we have in the New Testament, Paul's letters and the letters of other inspired writers are given to us by God. We have legal literature in the Bible. It's all different kinds of literature, but inspired by God. So, Dr. Zook has a good literary illustration. He compares it to the natural realm, like the interior design of a home. The coordination of elements when you walk into a home and you see how colors are put together and different arrangements of furniture coordinated to make the best use of the room and to make it appealing to the person who walks in. It all goes together to create an overall effect which is both functional and pleasing to the eye. That's his illustration about how literary style does the same thing with respect to words. So the Bible can be compared to this. It's marvelously designed by God, using all the various forms and styles of great literature to communicate truth to us. And this ties in with the fact that we've mentioned in our axioms that the Bible is a human book. Communicated through human authors, inspired, yes, but used by God to give us truth in this marvelous literary masterpiece. Dr. Zook said, the more you know of the patterns, styles, and forms of the various units in a book of the Bible, the more you will know of that book's purpose and unique character, and hence the better you will understand it. And I think that's fair. So let's talk about then the Bible as literature. What do we mean when we speak of literary, or another word for it is rhetorical interpretation? The English dictionary defines rhetoric as a style of language, the art of writing or speaking as a means of communication with concern for literary effect. Literary effect. Excuse me. Rhetorical interpretation seeks to determine how the style, the particular verbal elements or ways of expression and form, how it's organized, its structure, influence how a passage is to be understood. Rhetorical interpretation is the process of determining the literary quality of a writing by analyzing its genre, again, the kind of literature that it is, its structure, how it's put together, how the material is organized, and then figures of speech, which are colorful expressions used for literary effect. We're going to talk about that, and how those factors influence then the meaning of the passage, book, text, paragraph we're dealing with. And this, again, is inspired literature. The inspiration of the Bible includes all of these wonderful literary aspects. God did not simply give us a theological textbook. He could have, but He didn't. He gave us inspired literature to communicate truth about His person and work. The Bible as literature then records human experience as God interacts with mankind, revealing His person and plan and purpose as history sovereignly progresses and unfolds in that idea of progressive revelation and as it's recorded. The Bible speaks of people's emotions and conflicts. It doesn't hide things. Victories and defeats, joys and heartaches, imperfections and sins. Don't we see that? God doesn't hide that from us. Spiritual losses and gains. It contains intrigue, suspense, excitement. Weaknesses are recorded, disappointments, reversals of fortune are there. Many other experiences of mankind as God's history is recorded to give us truth. It's an exciting book. It's an exciting book. Scholars freely admit that as the inspired authors wrote Scripture, they did so with a literary artistry of the highest order under God's hand. Leland Ryken states, biblical authors wrote in well-understood literary conventions and with a grasp of literary principles. They knew how to tell stories with well-made plots as they recorded history to give us truth, theological truth as history is recorded. They knew how to tell these stories that are unified by the principle maybe of tragedy or satire. Biblical poets knew how to invent apt metaphors for us, how to put statements into parallel form, which is part of Hebrew poetry. Most of them were masters of style. That's what Leland Ryken says. Wonderful book, and we want to dive now into exploring some of the genre of literature.